Welcome to Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder 101 tutorials. I'm Joy Mahone, and in this lesson, we are going to cover pants fitting. Now, I'm going to tell you up front, there are many approaches to pants fitting, many methods, and many techniques to learn. So my goal here is to share with you some of my favorites that are going to give you enough knowledge and skills in your sewing toolbox so that you're going to have amazing results. This lesson corresponds to our Wardrobe Builder March and April episodes on pants fitting and pants sewing, but just know that the information I share with you here, you can use with any pair of pants that you are sewing. Well, there's a lot to learn, and pants fitting can be really, really rewarding. It starts with understanding how pants interact with our body. So we're going to jump into learning about body mass placement, how pants interact with our body. We're going to jump over to the cutting table, learn how to adjust a pants pattern, and then we're going to finish off with learning some basic pants techniques that we can do when we're fitting a pant muslin. And yes, it is imperative when you are sewing pants that you create a muslin fit sample. I know we're trying to sew, use the best use of our time, but if you take a little effort up front and a little time to fit, create a fit sample, and really polish a pattern, then you have a fitted pant that you can make over and over again. So that little bit of time up front really is a huge time saver in the long run. Well, I love pant sewing. There's a lot to learn, so let's head over to the cutting table and get started. Before we adjust our paper pattern, we want to take a look at our body measurements when it comes to fitting a pair of pants pattern. And really understanding body measurements and how they interact with an actual pants pattern is key to really getting the best fit possible, especially if you have any sort of fit issues on the lower body. So I want to talk about a few areas of measure. These are not all of them. I teach a lot of pants fitting, and so what I'm doing here is just kind of honing in on the basic ones that you can start to dabble in and really master these before you even move on. Well, obviously we have things like measuring around the full waist. That's easy, right? Well, that is easy if you measure your natural waistline. I highly encourage you when it comes to pants fitting, we're going to make a fit sample. So that initial fit sample, I really prefer that it goes all the way up to our natural waistline. Now I know there's all these jokes about mom jeans and these pants that go all the way up to the natural waistline. You don't have to leave it there, okay? So in our example here, our Sasha pattern, it is a cropped or a lower rise pant, and you'll notice it does not go all the way up to the natural waistline. So what we wanna do is take your pattern and just extend. So if I have this pattern right here, and we just want to take a ruler and extend the height of the pattern. We'll see that over on the pattern table. But what that will do is when you're putting a fit sample on your body, doing some pinning, you're taking it off, doing some more pinning, putting it on and off your body, that natural waistline gives you a stationary point for every time that you put those pants on, they go to the exact same spot. Because what happens is if you're doing a muslin fit sample on something cropped, you have to pay special attention that you are putting them on the exact same spot every time. Otherwise, if you're fitting them a little higher and then the next time you put them on and they're a little lower, then it's loose. And so you tighten it and then you put them on and they're a little higher and then they're tight. You get the idea. So really, if you can fit a pair of pants to your natural waist, that is going to really ensure the best success. So that's number one. Let's talk about a few circumference measurements around the body. And I love this pant mannequin that I have because if I turn it, you will notice that it actually has a fairly natural looking derriere, and it's dropped. It's not like the bottom isn't up high. And this is really representative of most females. So you have a fuller derriere that typically is much lower than where the full hip is across the front of the body. Now, she doesn't have exaggerated hip lines on this mannequin, but it's pretty standard and pretty typical. I see it a lot that people have more of the hip contour higher on the body, but their full hip on the back is much lower. So the next thing I want to point out is that we really want to think of our pants pattern as distinctively different front from the back, okay? So kind of forget what you're normally used to doing, lining up the hip line so that there's one continuous hip line around the body. That really doesn't happen. I mean, it does, but a lot of times we're very different from front to back. So it's absolutely okay if your hip line on the back doesn't touch the hip line of the front at the side seam. Yes, we want to join these pieces together and contour them. And yes, those balance lines or those hip lines should be parallel to the floor so that we can make sure our pants hang and drape correctly. But those lines, they don't need to touch at the side seam. That doesn't help us fit. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go into our pattern adjustments. So another circumference one would be measuring around our full thigh. And that's really easy. Find the fullest part of your thigh, measure around it, and then determine how far down it is from the crotch or the fork of the pant, okay? So you would measure down on your pants pattern and determine if the distance on the pattern matched where you're fullest on the thigh. We'll see this over on the paper pattern shortly, but I want to point out another interesting thing about that full thigh. You can really do a front and a back measurement. So use some sticky dots or some sort of marking tool, and you can take a tape measure and just literally hold it at your side seam on your waist and let it fall. And that will tell you where your side seam is on your body. Just take a couple sticky dots and reach down your side and stick them there. Or if you have someone helping you do your marking, then they can do that. You can also do the same thing with a plumb line down the inseam. Letting that hang down the inseam. And there are some ways that you can do a girth measurement this way and then affix a tape measure to it so that the tape measure hangs nice and straight. And then you can put a few sticky dots on the inseam of your leg. That allows you a start and stop point for measuring across the front as well as then measuring across the back, okay? You probably get the idea. We're gonna take these to our pattern and kind of see how they line up. All right, so let's see here. There are many things we could talk about. We'll adjust some length areas in the pattern. For example, on this particular pattern, the derriere is dropped. And so if you have a full hip line on your pattern, that if I were to take my pattern and lay that up here, for example, you'll see there's a line right here. Well, if that line needed to be down here, then I need to lengthen that area of the pattern. So we're just talking a little bit of theory here about body measurements. You can take more. Those are the ones I'm going to focus on. But the last thing that I really want to kind of delve into is body mass. And typically, most patterns most designers create their patterns for a standard shape or a standard dress form. Even if I use this mannequin to make a pair of pants, you might look at that and say, okay, that does not look like my leg shape whatsoever or my hip shape. So we want to look at pants as far as the shape of the pant matching the shape of our body. So we're going to use SpongeBob as an example. So everyone get a picture of a SpongeBob SquarePants in your mind. It's a square that has like 2 stick legs on it, all right? And those stick legs are very far apart. Now, some people have kind of a SpongeBob placement of their legs on their torso. So rather than being close together, they have a wider span, okay? So if you have a pair of pants where they're close together, but your legs are farther apart, you can make that pant leg wide all you want. You can add up your measurements, but it's not going to really translate over to the pant matching your body. Therefore, you're going to have fit issues. So you just want to kind of think about, okay, where do my legs join my body? Are they close together? For example, some people have fleshy inner thighs that are much closer together. And so in that case, you might have more pattern or more body mass from the center of the leg to the inside, whereas somebody else might have it from the center of the leg to the outside. So start thinking about those things as you're customizing your pattern. How do you know where to put that? Well, the last thing I want to share with you is a plumb line down the front of the body. And this plumb line, if you were to join it to the torso, would, if you followed that straight up the body, it should intersect with the apex area and go all the way up to the shoulder. But more importantly, look at your lower body and determine if you're standing straight and if you were to let a tape measure fall down your body, and you can do that, just hold it at your waist, stand naturally, and just let it naturally drape. Then you can just stand in the mirror and you'll be able to tell, oh, you know, I have way more body on this side of the tape measure. Maybe I have way more body to the inside, or maybe it's fairly even. It's fairly even on my mannequin here. But again, if you're SpongeBob, you're gonna have most of your body over here. So your pant pattern needs to correspond to that, because then even if the whole pant leg circumference matched your body measurements, if it doesn't match the placement of your body mass, they're not going to correspond. So I know that's a little bit of theory that might seem a little complex. Hopefully not. Hopefully that just gets you thinking about, oh, well, maybe that's why my pants don't fit when I make them or buy them. That's really my goal. Well, let's jump over to the cutting table. We're going to look at this in the actual pants pattern and do some basic adjustments, and hopefully you'll be well on your way to having perfectly fitted pants. Well, one of my absolute favorite things to do in sewing is the fitting of the pattern. And what I've done here is we have the Sasha trouser pant pattern in tissue, which I have featured in the Nancy's Notions Wardrobe Builder March issue. And it's a full-size pattern, which is a little bit big to see on camera. So I have a shrunken down version of the pattern that I've just traced onto an oak tag pattern. Now, I want to talk first about the parts of a pattern. And so let me grab my marker here. Now, if I'm working on pants patterns in my studio, I just use a pencil, regular sewing tools, but I'm going to use some markers just so you can really see the area that I am addressing. Well, we know that we are going to have a green line on our front and back of our pant pattern. And as we're marking our pattern, I do want to interject that there are many things that we can learn about a pants pattern. So these are just some of my favorites. It's not everything that you can do to a pair of pants, but enough that is going to get you very well on your way to having great fit. Okay, so we've marked a grain line on our pattern. The next thing I want to point out is this little area right here. And we know the difference between the front and the back because we can look at the shape of the crotch curve. Now, which do you think is the front and which do you think is the back? Well, the back is usually, and I guess I've never run into a situation where the back was much shorter, unless maybe I had someone that had a pregnant belly where the front needed to be significantly longer. But even in that case, that usually happens in the upper portion of the front of the pattern. So typically the back has a longer curve because we have the buttocks, which is going to fit in there. And then we have the front, which usually is a much shorter, less angled curve. So even if our pattern didn't say front or back, we would know what the difference was. Now, some of you may encounter a one-piece pants pattern that may look something like this, where there is no side seam. You can also take a pair of pants pattern and line up the waist and the hem and join them together. Pay attention to how much overlap you have in the hip area. If there is a significant overlap, then you can do one of two things. You can just butt up the edges together, and then you can actually sew a dart in the waistline, which would be where the seams are angled right there. So that is kind of a fun creative lesson for another day, but I thought I'd just share a little bit of that. So we have the fork of the crotch curve, and then we have the hip area. and then the knee area, and then the ankle area. So I'm gonna go ahead and put some marking lines, at least on the front of my pattern, to illustrate some of what we're talking about. Now, your pants pattern, if you are working with a commercial pattern, it will probably have a line on it that says hip line. All right, so I'm just drawing this right now, but your pattern will say hip line. That hip line is traditionally above the fork in the front. And if you're using like real traditional methods, 7 to 9 inches down from the waist. I know when I draft patterns, I have my own custom application of where that line is based on my personal fit system that I do. So it may vary from pattern to pattern, but a good pattern maker will have a hip line marked on there. But we're going to learn that we can modify that. And then we're also going to have a thigh line. Now, this is not always marked on a pants pattern, and it may be slightly below the fork, or it may be if you drew a line from the peak of the fork over. So if your pattern does not have a thigh line marked on it, then what I like to do is about an inch down on a full-size pattern, so an inch down from that fork, I'm going to draw a line across here and mark that the thigh. All right, now further down, you're going to have an area of where the knee, and then of course we have our ankle down at the bottom. But we're going to mainly focus on fitting the upper part of the pattern, which is where the focal point of fit in pants is. Once you get a pair of pants to lay correctly over the hip, skim the full thigh, from there you can determine how wide or narrow you want your pant leg and do some creative design. But the bulk of the fit and how it functions with the movement of the leg is going to happen in the upper portion. The same thing applies to the back of the pattern. We're going to go ahead and measure down an inch from the fork, and then we're going to draw the thigh line. And then of course, again, if you're working with a commercial pattern, it will probably have a hip line. Now, one interesting thing about that hip line on a commercial pattern is quite often, and I mentioned this in the intro, that they connect. So if I were to flip this over and redraw that hip line, it makes us feel good and warm and fuzzy inside as sewers if we have this continuous line. But I treat it very differently, as I mentioned when we were talking about measuring the body. The hip line around the body is not like measuring our full bust, where we have like this continuous line around the torso. On the lower body, and again, just rewind this episode and watch and look at my mannequin where we have a lower hip line on the back of the body and maybe a higher one in the front. So from here on out, I don't care if these lines touch at the side seam. What I do care is that they're parallel to the floor so that the pants hang correctly. But then once we go to sew these together, we can contour and pin fit the side seams. And then once they're all pin fitted, if we want to go back and make one continuous line as a reference for balance line, we can do that. But how we're treating these markings on the pattern is they're different from front to back. All right, well, on our March issue, we are using the Sasha pattern. So you're going to want to reference your size chart to pick your pattern, and I recommend picking it off of your full hip. Even if your hip is smaller than your waist, that's just what I recommend on there. Now, this is a slim fit pant, which means that it is going to fit a contoured and fitted to the body. So you may choose to go a size larger, but we're going to make a fit sample, which is definitely going to be imperative in our pants. Well, let's take a look at a few more of those measurements that we talked about when we were looking at our dress form. I'm going to go in the order that I presented them in. So first of all, we have the overall waistline. And so if I flip this over, we have a continued waistline. That's an easy one. That is a line that definitely continues all the way around the body. Now our waistline, it's kind of like a gyroscope or like a hula hoop. So if you have a waistline that tilts, So if my fingers right here are the center front, okay, some people have a waistline where it's tilted. Maybe it's, and use my thumb as the back. So maybe it's higher in the back and lower in the front. Some people have a more pronated front where it's higher in the front and scooped in the back. Some people are very balanced. Some people, if you have a high hip or on either side, it's going to do that. So we want to look at our waistband as like a hula hoop or this rotating circle on our body. We are very used to pulling a pattern out of an envelope and seeing like this nice straight line. But that is, again, it's just a standard shape that shows up on patterns because we need some sort of launching off point. It's not bad. We just have to recognize that if we're having fit issues, that might be because that shape of the pattern edge and that pattern piece doesn't match our body. But what I do want to do is just kind of measure around the pattern. Do not include darts when you're measuring. So you want to jump over those and then resume your tape measure and make sure that the front matches the front and the back matches the back. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into some vertical adjustments on the pattern. As I mentioned, and I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between the front and the back. So if it helps, I'm going to put a big F here for the front and a large B for the back, just so if you want to follow what I'm doing. But as I mentioned a moment ago, it could be that maybe our hip line on the back of our body is much lower. And because of that, we want to make sure that from our waist to the hip line of the pattern matches the waist to the hip line on our body. So we're going to go to our body and measure from the waist to our hip line. Start with the front, start with the back, doesn't matter, but we're treating them separately. So for example, let's say that we measure the back and the hip line is right here. Well, we want that to match our body. Now, what happens if the distance from the pattern from here to here doesn't match? Well, if we're longer, then what we want to do is we want to cut through our pattern approximately in the middle of the area that we're measuring. Very rarely do I measure on a line because if our hip line needs to be down here, for example, then we need that space to be absorbed in that whole area. All right, so we're gonna start right here, and then basically we're spreading our pattern to add length. Don't worry about your pattern now being too long down here. That's not important right now. But what we're doing here is we're adding length, or the opposite. So if we were to overlap this, see how the upper part of that now becomes shorter. So longer, shorter. And you should be able to look at this pattern and look at your body and say, oh yeah, that does or does not match my body. Well, I always like to illustrate in exaggerations because it's easier to see. So I'm just going to tape that down on my pattern paper here, and I'm just going to kind of color in. So this is where we have now lengthened. So now the waist to the hip line, forget about everything else. So if I measure waist to hip line on my body and I go to my pattern and measure waist to hip line, they should match exactly. The next thing we're going to do is the exact same thing. You're going to go to your hip line and measure down to your thigh. Or since we've already got this up here, you can measure from the waist down to the thigh and see how that matches your body. And the same thing applies. If this thigh is too low or too high, then you need to increase that length or shorten it to match. And you're going to do the same thing as far as cut approximately in the middle. And you don't have to draw an actual line there. You really don't. You're just absorbing the adjustment within the body of fitting, not on the edge. So for example, here, if I had a shorter distance from waist, and it'll happen below the thigh line. So if I had a shorter distance, I would overlap, and it might be a little easier to see it doing it this way. So if I overlapped, you'll now see that, oh, look, the thigh line is now where it needs to be. We will definitely need to polish off this edge. We'll get to that. So you can adjust lengthen or shorten so that the fullest part of the leg corresponds to the fullest part of your leg. All right. We'll do the same thing on the front of the pattern. So I'm not going to repeat that here, but this is why they may very much be different from front to back. Let's do just a little bit of an overlap. So we're shrinking these together. I'm going to tape that together. Your checks and balances are take your body measurements, go back to your pattern and compare waist to thigh. That length should be exactly what your body is. You're never squeezing into the pattern, you're making the pattern match you. Now at this point, what I would do is just true up or kind of blend into the crotch curve here. So you can very much adjust your pattern and then just polish the edge. Okay, so, and I said I wasn't gonna do the front, but I think I will just to illustrate that the front, maybe the front has a shorter hip line. So if I were to shorten that, you'll see how that got a little squattier. And so the hip line, or the widest part, and I say hip line, but really it's the widest part across the front of your upper pant area. So if we were to put these side by side now, you'll notice that that line is all the way up here, whereas the hip line on the back is lower. They're still parallel to the floor. Doesn't matter that they don't touch. We'll blend the side seam when we do a muslin fit sample, but that gets the proportion where it needs to be. So it's really pretty easy. Then what we want to do is we just want to check some width measurements, and I mentioned the body mass. And so let's kind of discuss that just real briefly, because a majority of your fit in your pants happens at this phase. If you can get the scale and proportion of your pattern to match your body, then you're well, along the way with sewing your pants. So a little time here saves a ton of time later. All right, so I'm going to draw on this pant pattern. So here's our standard pant pattern, but what happens if maybe we have a high hip or a pant leg here. This is our knee, this is our calf, and we kind of draw down there. Okay, now I'm going to actually draw over top of the pant. So maybe the center front is the same, but as we go down, so this is our kneecap. So if we're just, if we can kind of see through, I'm going to make this just a little darker. And this should kind of get the point across. All right, so here we have a knee line. So if this were like a fashion illustration, you'd have another leg on this side. But if this were our pant pattern and we sewed it together at the center front seam, and this was how the pant hung, look at where the body mass of our leg is. You'll see that there is not enough pant over here to meet the shape and the contour of the leg. And this is why when you put a pair of pants on and, there's drag lines in weird spots, or, many things can show up. It just very much could be that you're using a standard shape out of an envelope when you have a very custom contour and shape to your body. So the solution to this is really very easy. It's just a couple width measurements across here. So remember that whole plumb line that I said on your body, so you can determine where that plumb line is. And I'm just going to make this really dark here. All right, so you'll see that here there's much more body mass on this side as there is right there. So that means there's many ways to approach this, but a really quick way would be to cut up the leg of the pant and spread the pant so that it matches your body. That's kind of a very quick version of my actual pant fitting system. So if someone said, okay, what's just a really quick way to do it? This might be one thing that I would do. So what I'm doing now is widening. I'm moving this part of the pant leg over. Now I'm not done yet, but I can get the knee to match my body. And now what I can do is I can use the contour, I can measure my body across that front thigh, and I know how far to go out or in, all right, so that I can make a pair of pants that contour to my body. So how would my pattern look? My pattern now is going to take on the new outer edge that I have here. So instead of this straight line, I've measured out, I put a line here, I've measured my waist, and I basically go in and take like a curve and make this pant fit my body, okay? Now, really, that may look complicated. It might be a big eye-opener for some of you. My main takeaway is that I want you to realize that the shape of the pant leg that comes out of your pattern envelope, depending on the style of pant you're making, the fabric you're using. If you're using a stretch fabric, maybe you don't need to do this. But if you're using like trouser fabric, maybe you need to make sure that that pant hangs over your body correctly. So that's just, again, kind of cutting up the grain, spreading your pant or overlapping it left or right so that you either have more or less so that the pant matches your body. That's really the key. And then, of course, if you have some sort of contour, you just need to measure these width measurements on here and make it match. I hope you'll try that. Feel free to share in the comments if you're doing this. Again, I want to reiterate there are many ways to fit a pair of pants, but that's a really quick one that you can do and play around with. And again, you might do it on the front and not on the back. The next step is once you have adjusted vertically and horizontally for your body measurements is to cut this out of muslin and make a fit sample. And do not sew a pair of pants without making a fit sample. My recommendation is to add seam allowance if you don't have seam allowance in your pattern, but add seam allowance, and I like a good 2 inches right down the side seam and even the inseam, and then I baste these together and try them on my body and do some fitting. And from there you can do a little pin fitting and then take that muslin fit sample apart. You can use that as your new pattern, or you can lay your muslin back on your original tissue, trace off some of the markings, and then you'll be well on your way to a much better fit in pants. Well, just a few tips and tricks, not all of them, but I challenge you, try these, and best success in your pants fitting.